Hi everyone, today I'm going to bring you an update on using the Expo-auth-session package to authenticate with Google. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to provide different client IDs, so Expo client ID, iOS client ID, and Android client ID. You can do that via the Google website, and I'm going to show you how to do that for both Android and iOS. My previous version of this showed a bug that was stopping you from authenticating with Google in a standalone Android app, but from now on it's been fixed, and so you should be able to authenticate with Google. So what I'm going to do first is I've added the Expo-auth-session, Expo-random, and Expo-dev client packages. I've added Expo-dev client so I can easily build my standalone app and can test on Android and iOS, because that's where it was working, and you need to kind of test this because you're providing different client IDs. I'm also going to go ahead and update my app.json, and I'm going to provide a bundle identifier for iOS and also a scheme and my package name for Android. So this is basically just going to be used when I'm creating my client IDs on the Google website. I'm going to make my scheme the same as both of these. So now that that's sorted, I can go ahead and configure my build profile. So I'm just going to type the command eas build configure, and it's basically going to generate an eas.json file, which will have my different build profiles, which is development and production. And for iOS, I want to specify that it's going to be run on a simulator, and that's going to give me the correct file type to drag across onto my simulator and install so that I can test on iOS locally. I'm going to copy my scheme because I'm going to need that to create my client IDs, and now I'm going to head over to Google and create my client ID for iOS. So first off, when you are creating your client IDs, you first actually need to configure the consent screen. It's basically going to say what app is requesting your access and stuff like that. So I'm just going to make it external, but it's just going to be, I'm not going to publish it because I'm just doing a test one. I'm going to provide a user support email, and you can provide some different things like app logo, but I'm just going to provide what's required, because it's just showing you guys how to do this. So once I've got all the information, I can go ahead and save and continue. Then you need to specify things like what scopes the user's granting permission for you to have access to. So I'm just going to specify that I want access to basically the personal info that will identify the user. Whoops, I forgot to update there, so I'd better do that. Once I've done that, I can save and continue. You can add other scopes if you want access to other things like calendars and stuff like that. I'm going to specify a test user because only test users can log in using the test configuration screen. Once you publish, anyone can sort of log in using it, but while it's in testing, you can only have testers test it. Cool, then it gives you a summary of everything that you've entered, and it's created that consent screen. If I wanted to publish it, I could click that Publish App button and it would move out of testing. Now I'm going to go create my client IDs. So first off, I'm just going to create my iOS one. That's the simplest one. And I'm just going to specify the bundle ID. You can specify the App Store ID and the team ID if you want, but bundle ID is the only one that's required. It gives me my client ID, which I'll copy and paste into my app.js later when I connect to the Google authentication services. So now I'm going ahead and creating my Android client ID. So to do that, you actually need to provide the SHA-1 finger fingerprint, and so I'm going to need to run EAS credentials to do this. I'm just selecting a few of the default options, and it's going to give me my fingerprint, and then I can copy and paste it into the Google website. Cool, so I'm just going to copy and paste that SHA-1 fingerprint. And then I can create my OAuth client ID for Android. So once again, I'll copy that later in. So now that I've created a few client IDs, I can get started on my code for authenticating with the Google. I'm going to need to import a few other components just to show you guys this. So what I'm going to do is I'm importing an image because I'm going to show the image of the logged in user. I'm also importing a button because I want to be able to click to log in to bring up that prompt. And I'm also importing star as Google from the Expo-auth-session providers Google. So there's some helpful built-in providers for Facebook and Google because they're quite commonly used, which includes like the discovery endpoints and stuff like that. For other providers, you're going to need to sort of find those out yourself and then do the discovering accordingly. I can do some other videos on other providers. If you guys are interested, let me know in the comments what providers you're interested in. I'm going to need to store the access token, so I can go ahead and load up the user info when the user presses a button. I'm going to set that to undefined at the beginning because I haven't received the access token until the user has logged in. So that's going to be set once the user logs in. So I'm just going to start this up and open it on iOS. So I'm going to add a new button on screen that's going to say log in if there's an access, get user data if there's a access token, and log in if there isn't. Okay, yeah. So I've imported useState directly, so I don't actually need to go react.useState. Cool. Because there's no access token, I can see a login button. And I'm going to want to add a function that will be called when I log in. But first I need to get this prompt async function from Google, which is going to allow me to open up the web view and to the Google OAuth endpoint and then let the user log in. I'm going to provide the Android client ID, iOS client ID, and Expo client ID here. I haven't created the Expo client ID, so let's go ahead and do that after I've copy and pasted the Android and iOS client IDs in. I'm going to do a bit of development inside the Expo app, but if you don't need to do any development inside the Expo app and you just want to use your standalone apps, that's fine, and you don't actually need to create an Expo client ID. It's just if you're wanting to do it inside the Expo Go app. Gives you the instructions here on what to do. I'm just going to go ahead and create the credentials. It'll specify a web application, and this is just going to be my Expo client. I'm going to add an authorized JavaScript origin, and I'm just going to copy that from the Expo documentation. I'll link this in the description below, and you can check out my code on GitHub as well. And I'm also going to add the authorized redirect URI. You specify your own username and your own project slug. go ahead and create that, and you'll have your Expo client ID, which you can then copy into your text editor of choice. You don't actually need that client secret. Oh yeah, by the way, don't expose your client IDs to people, and I'm also going to be deleting this project after I've demoed this, so you won't be able to use these actual client IDs. You'll have to create your own. So I'm going to use useEffect, which is basically going to be called anytime response changes. And what I'm going to do inside here is I'm going to check if the response type is equal to success. And basically what that means is that the user successfully logged in, and then I can set the access token so that I can make my further calls to get data about the user. I'm going to need to write a function that's going to be able to use that access token, and I'm calling it getUserData. When the button's pressed, if there's an access token, I'm going to get user data, and otherwise I'm going to log in. So I'm going to need to provide these different options. So if there's an access token, I'll call get user data, and otherwise I'll call prompt async. You can specify whether you want to use a proxy. I've set that as false, and you can specify show in recents. If you want to learn a bit more about what the different options are and what they mean, you can just look at the Expo documentation, and I'll link that in the description below. So once I click on that, it opens up the authentication window, and I can choose my account. It says something went wrong, and I can tell you what that is. It's actually that when you're using the Expo Go app, you're wanting to use proxy to be true, and that's just basically going to allow you to use their proxy and actually allow it to come back and give you the access token back. So now it's giving me a little bit of a different prompt, and I've clicked yes, and it gives me that get user data button. I'm going to also want a function that shows the user data when the user data has been received from the endpoint. So I'm just going to create that function here. And I can just call that from within my, my view that I return. So I'm only going to want to show data if there is user info, and if there is, I'm just going to return basically the name, the email address, and an image, the profile image. I'm going to specify some styles that I'll define later. So this one's going to be user info. Then I'm going to have an image. This is going to be the profile picture. I can specify the source, which is going to be user info. That picture. So basically that's the from the data that I'm going to request from the Google endpoints. And then I'm going to give that a style of profile pic, which I'll define in a moment. Also going to have some text basically welcoming the user by their name. And finally, I'm just going to display their email address. Cool, so that's all I want to show. So now I can go ahead and I can create the styles. So I've got my profile pic. I'm going to want to set a width and height for that so that it's a controlled size. I'm also going to want to create a user info style, which is going to be the view that contains all the user info. And you can see it there. So now I'm going to want to go ahead and build my standalone app so I can show you the app actually working as a standalone app on iOS. So I'm just going to specify that I'm building for the platform iOS and for the profile development. And I'll do the same thing for Android because I'm wanting to show that it's working on both, as previously there was a bug with the Android version that would cause authentication with Google to fail. So if you open up the link that it gives you when you write that command, it will show the build progress, and when it's completed you can download it. I'll also do the Android version, which will just queue up because I'm not building locally. You can choose to build locally if you want. You just need to install a few things. And there's a little bit of a description of how to go about that inside my source code, which you can check out on GitHub. I'll link that in the description below. So once those are completed, I can go ahead and download. I'm just downloading the iOS version right now. And that's going to give me a tar file, which when I unzip it, it's going to have the file that I can drag onto the iOS simulator. So you can see it's given me an application file called Auth-session Google example. I'm just going to exit out of my app and install that just by dragging it across. You can see it installs on the device. Then I'm going to want to go ahead and start up my app using the Expo start command, and I'm going to go --dev client to open inside that dev client, and I'm going to hit I to open on iOS. It's just going to open inside that standalone app. It's going to give me that same pop-up, and I've got my login button here. When I click it, I click continue, and I can choose my username, and it gives me the option to get the user data, and you can see that's working successfully. So now that I've shown you iOS, I'm going to show you Android. So I'm just going to first download that APK file, and I'm going to open the simulator and drag that onto the simulator. That's going to install the APK file so that I can test it on Android as a standalone app. Once again, I'm running that Expo start --dev client command. And there's the login button, and it'll take me off to the Google Authentication screen. When I click on my user, it comes back and I've got the option to get the user data. And you can see that works successfully, which previously wasn't working, and I've detailed in another video that I can link in the description below if you want more info on why it wasn't working previously. Next, I'll show you how to use a refresh token to get a fresh access token, because access tokens will expire after a certain period of time. I'm just going to console log the access token I get from the Expo Go application. So you can see there I've got my access token, and it says when it expires and when it was issued at. The thing about Expo Go is that the OAuth flow type used, it seems to not return a refresh token. But if you use the standalone Android and iOS apps, it's going to return a refresh token for you to use. So if you're wanting to add refresh token logic in, you're probably just wanting to work in your standalone app because it'll just be a bit easier. Yeah. So I'm going to show you that now. So I've just set that use proxy to false. So I'm going to open it on my iOS application. So I'm just doing Expo start dev client, and then we'll open on iOS. And that's going to open my standalone iOS app. And it's going to console log my access token once I log in. Cool, so I'm going to go ahead and click login and continue. And then I'm going to select my account. That's going to update that response, which is going to trigger this to be logged, because it's going to trigger the use effect code. You can see I've got an access token, an ID token, I've got expires in, and I've also got an issued at date, and there's also this refresh token here. So basically, once the access token expires, I can make a request to the OAuth endpoint for a new token using that refresh token. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that. I'm going to also store that refresh token and access token to my device so that I can make those requests on future subsequent app loads, and I don't need the user to log back in again. You may need the user to log back in again if the token has been revoked. So yeah, I'm just going to show you revoking that token as well. So I've got my my auth that I'm going to set, and that's basically going to be whatever's in that response. It's going to include that refresh token. Then I'm going to go ahead and persist that auth to my device so that next time I open my app, I can load it up. So to persist it, I'm just going to write this asynchronous function here that's just going to save it to async storage. So I'm just going to go async storage.set item. Okay, so it's not seeming to load that. If I have a quick look, it's just due to how I've imported it. I want to just import async storage. And then I can go ahead and go .set item. Then I provide the key, which is just going to be auth. And then I can just store that item in there. I'm just going to go json.stringify so that it's a string and can be stored as a string in async storage. To get it back, I'm going to have to pass it back into a JSON, back into an object. Then I'm going to call my persist auth function, and that's just going to save it to my device so that next time I load up the app, I can get the persisted auth and use that token without the user having to log in. I'm just updating a few places where I've been using the access token, because I'm going to remove that access token side of things and just going to have it rely on that auth that I've saved. It's basically the same, but just has a bit more data in it. And now I can remove that access token and set access token as I've removed all references to it. Cool. Okay, so we've got this issue, and it's can be fixed by rebuilding. So I went ahead and rebuilt, and you can see that it's loading now. I'm going to go ahead and load from my async storage in this use effect function hook. So I've got my callback is basically going to just get that auth item out of async storage. So I'm writing a new async function called get persisted auth, and I'm going to call that. And inside that, I'm going to just load the item from the async storage. This is only going to get called once when the app loads because my dependency list is empty, whereas the use effect above will just get triggered whenever the response changes. So I'm going to get the item by its key, which is auth, as that's what I saved it as, and from there I can pass it back into an object. I'm just going to check whether it's null first. If it's null, it basically means that there's no auth saved, and that will mean the user's going to have to log in. But if it's not null, then it means that there is a value saved, and we can either refresh the token or use the access token. So I'm going to go ahead and log in now. I'm choosing my user. It gives me the option to get the user data, which I can do. And if I refresh, I'm not logged out anymore. You can see that it's still got that option to get user data. And that's because I've persisted it to async storage and then loaded it. I'm just console logging the persisted value there. So I've just updated it because I was using the state variable and that hadn't been changed at that stage. That was causing issues. So yeah, you can see that I can continue to get the data, but after it's expired, then I won't be able to do that anymore. So if I try and do it again, once that's expired, I'm going to get this issue here where it fails to load that data. I'm just going to do a console log of the data. And then you'll be able to see what happens when the access token's invalid or expired. So you can see I've got that still there. It looks like it should be all right, but the problem is it is actually expired at this point. I've gone forward an hour in time and waited for it to expire. Now I click Get User Data, and it says basically that request is missing the required authentication credential. And that's just because my token has expired, so it can't authenticate me. So basically I'm going to want to check whether the token's fresh or not. So to check whether the token is fresh or not, I can go auth-session.token-response.is-token-fresh, and then I just need to pass in the expiry date and also the issue date. It's giving false back because I actually forgot to pass the token values in there, and I'll rectify that a bit later. But yeah, you need to pass the expire when it's expired, how long until it expires, and also the issue date. And from there it will figure out whether it's fresh and requires a refresh. I'm going to have the state variable require refresh, and if it requires a refresh, I'm going to show the option to refresh the token. So I'm going to set my state variable here. And if we're requiring a refresh, then I'm going to go ahead and add a button that will allow the user to refresh. So I'm going to show the text that the token requires a refresh if it requires a refresh. And then I'm going to have a button that will enable the user to click on that button and refresh the token and give them a valid access token to make further requests for user data. So on press, I'm going to call this refresh token function that I'm going to create now. I'm going to need the client ID for this, so I'm just going to create a new function that's going to allow me to get the client ID. So I'm going to check what platform it is. If it's iOS, I'll use the iOS client ID, and if it's Android, I'll use the Android client ID. I'm not going to cater for other platforms at this stage. I'm focusing on mobile apps. If the platform is Android, then I'll return the Android client ID. And if not, I'm just going to console log that it's not a platform that's supported, basically. From my refresh token function, I can go ahead and get that client ID, and that's what I'm going to use when I'm refreshing my token, along with the refresh token. So I'm going to await auth-session refresh async, and I've got to pass a couple of things to that. So I need the config first, which is going to include the refresh token and the client ID. I'm also going to need to provide an endpoint that the refresh token is that's going to be called to refresh the token. So this is just the OAuth token endpoint. You can find this via discovery, but I just looked online for this. Once I've got my token, I can go ahead and I'm going to need that async, of course, because I've got an await there on the refresh async. But once I've got my token, I can go and set the auth, which will then mean that people can call the get user data API. And I'm also going to be able to persist it. This means on future loads of our application, we can request user data without having to log in. So now I can go ahead and refresh token, and it's giving me a possible unhandled promise, and it's saying network request failed. So I'm just going to try a different URL. I think that's probably because I have not put HTTPS at the beginning of my token endpoint. I'm just going to log my token, make sure that I've got the right thing and that's not causing the issue. Yeah, so you can see that token is there and it's still failing. So it must be the endpoint that I'm requesting. I can go ahead and update that endpoint. And it seems to have worked. But you can see that it's not actually taking me anywhere to actually be able to use that new refreshed access token. And so I need to reset require refresh to be false. Once I set that to false, it's going to allow me to use my access token. Okay, so it's actually giving me an issue, and I think what's happening here is the result token from when I do the refresh is actually different to the initial request. So if I go and have a look at what the result token is from the refresh, you can see it's actually got a lot less info in it. It's actually directly the authentication part of the response that I was previously setting to my auth. So I'm just going to copy and paste my refresh token that I was using previously so I can actually refresh, because that part wasn't evaluating correctly. I'm just going to use this to manually update my refresh token temporarily. That means that I'll just get it out of this bad state, because at the moment I've got it in a state where it's not really what it should be. I want it to have the refresh token in it, but I kind of lost it. So yeah, now that I've actually added that refresh token back in, I can set this back to being auth.refresh token, as that's what I'm setting as auth. Later on, I'm going to have to go and update a few places where I've set it to a more complete object from the initial request to the API, because they're a bit out of sync at the moment, but I'll do that in a moment. I'm going to need to set the token result.refresh token every time, because it isn't included in the token result, because it's something that doesn't expire. All that's returned in the token result is stuff that is relevant to the newly refreshed access token. You can also see every time I reload the app, it's actually not reloading and taking me straight to that page where I can get user data, and it's because I forgot to pass in when the token expires, and also when when it was issued at. Cool, so you can see when I update that, it allows me to get the user data. It's giving me issues, and that's because I haven't updated it to use the less complete auth result that I've saved. Cool. So now you can see that's working, and I've updated all the places appropriately, but there are still places that I need to update. When I initially request access to their Google account, I'm still saving that full response, but I should be saving just the authentication part of that. I also want to show you how to log out though, and so to do that I'm just going to add a button that will allow the user to log out. And that is only going to be shown when there is a user that's authenticated, so when auth is not undefined. I'm going to create a logout function, and what I'm going to do in this logout function is basically revoke the token. You can revoke the token, access token, or you can revoke the refresh token. Refresh token will mean that it can't be used again. Access token just means that the access token won't be valid anymore. So yeah, you can do it for either. Refresh would be probably more comprehensive. You can do both, would probably be also a good result. So when you're revoking the token, you want to specify what token you want to revoke. So that would be the auth.access token or auth.refresh token, depending on which one you want to revoke. Then you're also going to need to provide a revocation endpoint. I've just Googled this to get this. I'm also going to need this to make this async, is the revoking is an asynchronous function. And then I'm going to need to set auth to undefined because I want to log out. And I'm also going to want to delete my stored access token so that the user doesn't have it loaded next time they load the application. So I'm just going to set that auth item to be null. I can see that's keeping on telling me that my token's not fresh, and I believe this is because of how I have been saving and loading from the auth, so I'm just going to manually specify this just to make it obvious. So I'm just specifying the auth.expires in and the auth.issued at. Okay, so now I can see what the issue is. So basically, auth is not defined at this point because it has just been set and it hasn't the state isn't set at the point where I'm using the auth.expires in and auth.issued at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just use this auth from JSON variable, and I'm going to use that to pass into my is token fresh function, and that's basically going to mean that I have the actual values there rather than relying on the state variable, which isn't quite up to date at that point. Cool, so now you can see it actually logs me in and it allows me to get the user data. If I refresh, then it takes me back to that get user data page rather than showing me the refresh token page, which is what it was doing earlier. So now I'm going to go ahead and log out. You can see that's giving me this error, passing null undefined as value is not supported. So it's actually a remove item method that I should be using instead because I don't want there to be a value against auth anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and update my code to use that. So I'm just going to change this to remove item, and that takes the parameter of the key that I want to remove, which is auth. Now that I've logged in again, I can go ahead and log out if I want to. Okay, you can see that when I called get user data, it was actually giving me an error, and that's because when I get the result from the prompt async, it's actually I'm actually saving the whole thing, but I just should be saving the authentication part of that. So you can see I'm logging it all here, and I can see so much more things like the whether it was successful or not, and any error codes from the actual request to allow the user to authenticate. So here I am. I need to actually just use the authentication portion, as that's the part that has all the information I need, like the refresh token, the access token, and the expiring time and issued at data. And that will bring my app into sync, because I previously let it get out of sync by doing things in different ways in different places. Okay, so this is still a bit out of sync, and it's because it's got a different value saved there than what I was expecting, so I'm going to need to manually do a little workaround. I'm just going to use the auth.authentication.access token because that's what is currently saved against auth to log out, and then I can change it back and we'll bring our application back into sync with itself. So now when I log in, I should save that authentication portion of the response from this prompt. Getting user data, I'll be using the access token. Yeah, you can see that's working successfully. Logging out will also log me out. Okay, and you can see that didn't actually fully log me out. I actually need to set that user info to be undefined if it's there, because when there's user info, it assumes that you're sort of logged in. So now I'm logging in again just to show that's working. Getting user data shows that's working. Logging out, and it takes me back to login. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. If you have, please like and subscribe for more content. All my code will be available on GitHub.